Did you know that The Land Before Time has one of the shortest run times of any feature film? Including credits, the whole thing is 69 minutes long. No, really. This is because, as you may or may not know, the film was heavily edited, with a total of 19 scenes comprising 13 minutes of finished animation being removed. This wasn't because the film was running long. Even uncut, it would have been less than 90 minutes. It was because the film had been viewed by 2 child psychologists who determined that some of the content was potentially traumatizing to the very children who the film was aimed at. All of this is well documented from various sources, a combination of screenplays, storyboards, interviews with people who worked on the film, behind-the-scenes material, the novelization of the film, and unused footage from the trailer that has revealed a lot of what the cut scenes were like. But it goes even further than that. You can tell that so much was cut just by watching the movie. Most jarringly of all is the scene where the T-Rex, dubbed Sharptooth, first attacks 2 of the protagonists, a baby brontosaurus named Littlefoot and a baby triceratops named Sarah. During this encounter, Sharptooth has his eye wounded when a thorn-covered vine whips him in the right eye. However, in several shots before this actually happens, the eye already appears injured as the result of choppy editing that resulted from so many shots being removed. Another example is when Sharptooth attacks Littlefoot's mother in what is a genuinely spectacular fight. Towards the end of the fight, Littlefoot's mother has an inexplicable wound on her neck from a cut scene where Sharptooth tears into it. Other examples are a bit harder to notice, such as when Sarah just sort of vanishes from the movie for a few minutes, only to reappear as if she had never left. For the past few years, I've noticed a lot of fans of The Land Before Time, and of Don Bluth, and of just animation in general campaigning to get the uncut version of the film released for purchase. Not like rallying, of course, but just like online petitions and stuff. For the most part, I've just kind of ignored these efforts, seeing as how they are more often than not completely inconsequential. But I don't feel I can do that anymore. For all those who want to see the original version, or think they do at least, I have something to say. It's not what you think it is. I know a lot of you think that it's just really scary or disturbing or whatever, and it is, but it's more than that. It's worse than that. My father worked on The Land Before Time as one of the animators. The movie was produced by Don Bluth's long-defunct animation studio, which would go bankrupt just a few months after the film's release. The studio was founded by Bluth and other passionate ex-Disney animators, Dad included, who wanted to pursue their own projects. It should be no surprise then to learn that the animators weren't exactly rich like astronauts. Dad was single at the time and couldn't afford a babysitter. Half the time I would stay with my uncle, Jerry, and the other half I spent with Dad at the studio. There wasn't much for me to do while I was there, mostly just sit in the corner and draw stuff. At least there were plenty of art supplies. Given the working environment, I ended up drawing a lot of dinosaurs and other animals. It's well known that Don Bluth wanted to break away from Disney because he felt the studio was limiting and disrespectful to its artists. He and the other ex-Disney artists he joined with wanted to return to making the kind of movies that Disney was producing in the 40s. In fact, The Land Before Time was originally conceived as a sort of feature-length adaptation of the Rite of Spring segment from Fantasia. There would be no voice acting. The dinosaurs would have been portrayed entirely naturalistically. It was producers Steven Spielberg and George Lucas who decided to turn it into a more traditional talking animal movie. Instead, Bluth took inspiration from a different movie from the same time period, Bambi. I was always uncomfortable whenever Bluth was in the studio. He wasn't exactly the warmest or most inviting personality, not the sort of person to say good morning when you first came into work, or to ask if you wanted something when he went to go get coffee. Most of the time, he was just working in his office, going over the screenplay, refining character models, creating storyboards. You would think these would be more collaborative efforts, but no. He was less of a let's have a meeting to discuss this person and more of a do this or you're fired person. I didn't even think he knew my name. On those few occasions that he did talk with people, I never remember it being even remotely pleasant. I remember overhearing him speaking, or rather yelling, to other staff members working nearby, giving them some truly and needlessly harsh criticisms. A lot of these criticisms were the sort you would expect on an animated movie. It looks like shit, do it over. You're still off model, fix it, or I'll get someone else who can do it. No, how many times do I have to tell you before you people fucking listen? I even remember hearing a loud crashing sound from the next cubicle over, which I swear was him throwing someone's work into the garbage. But Bluth had other concerns which he would voice as well, with just as much vitriol, if not more. There was a certain phrase I heard repeatedly many times around the office by Bluth. I had no idea what it meant, and when I asked my dad about it, he really couldn't explain it to me. Or if he could, I couldn't remember. But even though I had no idea as to its meaning, Bluth would say it so often that I don't think I'll ever forget it. We're not making a fascist film. What did he mean by that? It would take years for me to finally put some of the pieces together. It's been so long that I'm not even sure I can trust my memory entirely. But, well, let me tell you what happened. It was a typical day for me. Dad picked me up from kindergarten during his lunch break. We stopped to get some Burger King before returning to the office. Shortly after I finished eating, I pulled out a picture book about... Well, I remember it had something to do with a squirrel who wanted to bake an acorn pie or something. Anyway, Bluth stormed into the office carrying a can of film. "What the fuck is this?" he shouted. By the way, just as a side note, that was my first time ever hearing the F-word spoken in front of me. My dad hissed at him. "Don," he said, gesturing to me with his head. Bluth didn't calm down, he kept going. "Did you even look at the notes I gave you? The color palette is all wrong and the background details are almost completely absent. The foreground elements haven't changed at all. What the hell were you thinking sending me this piece of shit?" Although Bluth was yelling at Dad, I had that same sort of sinking, guilt-ridden dread that I felt whenever a grown-up yelled at me. I stayed put in the corner of the office, using my book as a shield between Bluth and myself. "I'm sorry, Don. I just don't think those elements were necessary to the scene. Frankly, I think they're wholly inappropriate for the target audience." "You're missing the point," Bluth said, throwing the can of film on the ground. "Do you have any fucking clue what kind of movie we're making? We're not making some crypto-fascist piece of shit. Every detail is essential in order to express the story's greatest thematic elements. Without them, the whole thing makes no sense." "I don't care," Dad said. "I'm not drawing something like that in a film aimed at young children." "If you don't care, then why are you working on this project?" Bluth roared, seemingly hearing that phrase alone, removed from the context Dad had placed it in. "I care about the story," Dad said, trying to stay calm. "I don't care for traumatizing minors." "Who did you vote for?" Dad paused. "What? Who did you vote for?" "What the hell does that have to do with anything?" Dad said, growing so frustrated that he couldn't help but swear. "Tell me who you voted for," Bluth insisted. They went back and forth on the point several times before Dad admitted to voting for Reagan. "Why am I not surprised?" Bluth said in a loud, condescending voice. "It figures that someone who voted for that fascist fuckwad would have a problem working on a film like this." "What are you talking about?" Dad asked. "It's a movie about goddamn talking dinosaurs." "Of course that's what you'd say," Bluth said. "Only someone stupid enough to vote for Reagan could go all this time without seeing what it is we've been creating." "You're not hearing what I'm saying. It's bad for children." "It's exactly what children need," Bluth said, banging on the desk. They need movies like this to grow up, to keep them from turning into mindless drones enslaved by the corporations that will rape the earth and feed off the death and suffering of the marginalized. You're out of your mind, Dad said, actually laughing. Bluth just glared at him silently before saying, "It's disgusting that people like you are allowed to have kids." That was the final straw. Dad got out of his seat, picked me up in his arms, grabbed his coat, and pushed past Bluth. I was scared. I thought I was going to get hurt, but when Dad picked me up and took me away from there, I instantly felt better, relieved enough to cry at last. Dad and I had a long talk in the car on the way home. He told me he was very sorry for what Bluth had said and for what he had said. I just kept crying, asking Dad again and again, why is he mad at you? Dad was quiet for a while. When he finally spoke, he said, "Mr. Bluth wants to make something that I think is going to hurt kids. I won't make it for him," so he got angry. "Why does he want to hurt kids?" I asked. At this age, my dad was always quick to tell me that scary things I saw in movies or on TV or read about in books were all make-believe. Monsters aren't real. My child brain had misinterpreted this to mean bad people aren't real, so I was struggling to grapple with the fact that this fundamental part of my worldview was crumbling to pieces. "Mr. Bluth doesn't want to hurt kids," he said. "He wants to help them. The problem is he doesn't understand the difference." I still didn't get it. When we got home, Dad ordered pizza in an attempt to make me feel better. Thankfully, it all happened on a Friday, so Dad's efforts continued into the weekend. We got to go to the LA Zoo on Saturday and to Disneyland on Sunday, which I'm certain he did in part to spite Bluth. Anything I wanted, he got for me. It was one of the best weekends of my life, at least during that age. When Sunday night came, I asked Dad what he was going to do in the morning. "What do you mean?" he asked. "Are you going to go back to work for Mr. Bluth?" "Yes, I am," he said with a contented smile. "Why?" "I got a phone call from one of Mr. Bluth's bosses. They told me that they were sorry for what happened, and they're going to make everything all right." "Oh," I said, "that's good." I didn't know what that meant exactly, but the important part was that everything was going to go back to normal. In the following days, I was back spending every Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday afternoon at Don Bluth Studios, keeping myself busy while Dad worked on The Land Before Time. A few weeks after the incident, I was alone in Dad's office while he was in another person's office. Bluth came in, looked around, and saw me. At first, I tried to ignore him, staring down at the pterodactyl I was scribbling. Then he spoke to me. "Hey, sorry, what's your name?" "Gabe." "Hey, Gabe, how you doing?" "Good," I said, guarded. "That's great. How's your dad?" I grew more uncomfortable at the mention of my dad. "Good," I repeated. "That's great," he said quietly and quickly. "Say, Gabe, come with me. I want to show you something." I wasn't sure what to do. I know I certainly didn't want to go with him. No amount of fake smiling was ever going to make me forget what I saw that day when he barged into the office raving like a lunatic. On the other hand, Bluth was an adult. Hell, he was an adult my dad had to listen to, so surely that meant I had to listen to him as well. Struggling to figure out what I should do, Bluth winced a little before saying, "Come on." He didn't shout or yell, but it was a little more forceful, and I obeyed almost unconsciously. I put my stuff down and followed him out of Dad's office, down a few hallways, and into a room I hadn't seen before. When he opened the door, I saw what looked like a miniature movie theater with a big screen on one wall in front of a bunch of seats with red cushions. "You want to watch a movie, Gabe?" he asked in the kind of leading voice that adults use when they're trying to tell you they want you to do something. I wasn't in a position to object. I just said, "Okay." He smiled. showing his teeth the same way a shark does before snapping down on its prey. "Good," he said, before turning to a bag sitting beside the film projector. "Why don't you take a seat right up front, and I'll get it started." I followed his orders once more. Sitting in a front row seat as he rummaged through the bag, I could hear him muttering to himself. Though I couldn't make out exactly what he was saying, I recognized that the tone had become excited, as if caught somewhere between joy and frustration. He set up the projector and turned down the lights. Within moments, the movie began. Blackness filled the screen, bubbles rising up from the bottom. A tiny salamander-like creature darted through the water, snapping at a fish before being snapped at in turn by a huge crocodile-like beast. I jumped in my seat when the long jaw clamped shut several times like an elongated bear trap. After that, white words appeared on the screen. The Land Before Time. Obviously, I won't bother repeating the entire movie scene for scene, but I will highlight parts of it that were different from the theatrical version. Since this all happened so long ago, there are certain details that may just be me misremembering things, but I'll include them anyway, for the sake of posterity. First of all, the color palette was noticeably different. The final film was mostly bright orange skies, but I remember the skies being much more saturated, more red than orange, with long white clouds stretching across the sky like stripes. The nighttime scenes had vivid blue skies with bright white stars twinkling above. There are certain aspects of the opening narration that I remember hearing when I was with Bluth in the theater that I don't hear when I watch the movie today on Netflix. It's stated in the final cut that the leaves began to die, which is what forced the leaf-eating dinosaurs to search for the Great Valley. But I remember something in the original narration about the dinosaurs having eaten all the leaves, gorging themselves unchecked until there was nothing left to eat. The next major difference I remember occurred shortly after the introduction of Littlefoot, the young brontosaurus. Before hatching from his egg, a small dinosaur crept out from the shadows and sneaks into the nest. Besides Littlefoot, there are a few other eggs as well. The unnamed dinosaur grasps the other eggs in its knobby, clawed hands and breaks them open, one by one. I remember the cracking of the egg being loud, and a slimy substance oozed out from the cracks. The dinosaur pulls out the unborn siblings, still curled up, cold blue, and their eyes closed. There was no blood, but I remember squirming in my seat as the dinosaur's toothless beak squeezed their soft, lifeless flesh, as if feeling the same beak closing down on my arms. Tossing its head back, the dinosaur swallowed the dino fetuses whole. Littlefoot's mother began to stir. Seeing her neck rise, the dinosaur picks up Littlefoot's egg and attempts to flee, but Littlefoot's mother knocks him over with a careless sweep of her neck. The egg tumbles down to the ground, and Littlefoot hatches soon after. Remnants of this scene can still be seen in the final cut. The smaller dinosaur is shown trying to steal Littlefoot, though not the other eggs. However, if you look carefully, you can see the other eggs in the nest around Littlefoot have been broken into. The next scene, whose existence is confirmed through alternate sources, shows Littlefoot being attacked by a snake. The snake in question is pale white, with bloodshot eyes. In retrospect, there are elements of this scene that remind me of the scene from Disney's animated Jungle Book, where Kaa the python attempts to incapacitate Mowgli by hypnotizing him. As in the Jungle Book, the snake appears to Littlefoot as friendly, while appraising him top to bottom like a piece of meat. The snake then proceeds to cuddle with Littlefoot, who, just having hatched, still can't talk. Littlefoot giggles gleefully as the snake tickles his belly with the end of its tail. With Littlefoot totally off guard, the snake slithers over and around his body, underneath his legs, around his neck, and beneath his tail. The snake has a joyous look on its face as it does this. It slowly begins coiling around Littlefoot, who only slowly begins to realize that something isn't right. By the time Littlefoot realizes that he should be screaming for help, The snake's body wraps around his mouth. The snake faces Littlefoot straight on, the two looking each other in the eyes. The snake's mouth hangs open, licking its lips like a dog. It opens its jaw ready to swallow Littlefoot when his mother once again comes to his rescue, picking up the snake by its tail in her mouth, unwrapping it from around her son and tossing it away. It isn't until the appearance of Sharptooth that the next difference I can remember appears. As I mentioned before, this scene was one of the most severely edited in the whole film, and scars of this editing can be seen clearly in the finished product. Littlefoot and Sarah, the young Triceratops, are playing with frogs in bubbling water underneath the thorn tree. As the ground begins to shake, the frog vanishes. My eyes went wide, and I squeaked as the quiet of the scene was shattered by the sudden roar of the T-Rex, which crashed through the trees right towards me. In this close-up shot, the Rex's face was heavily wrinkled, almost like a naked mole rat save for the darkness of its skin. Eyes blazed red like angry jewels, their lights shining past the screen and onto my face as if it were me, not a pair of baby dinosaurs, that he was focused on, trying to snap with his monstrous jaw. Littlefoot and Sarah leap from the shelter of the tree to escape his bite, only to fall on their faces. The shadow looms over them as Sharptooth's foot comes crashing down into the water, the two young ones only narrowly avoiding it. They return to the thorn tree, Sharptooth lunging at them from between the roots. In order to escape, Littlefoot and Sarah climb into the hollowed-out inside, only for Sharptooth to rear overhead and attack them again. Once more, a close-up of Sharptooth filled the screen, and I put my fist on my lips. The constant, powerful clamping of his jaws was almost mechanical, save for that wrinkled, almost decrepit skin of his, and those vicious, single-minded eyes that seemed to look past the screen and right into mine. Sharptooth destroyed the thorn tree, forcing the two of them to flee. So far, none of what I've described of Sharptooth's attack was in the final film, but storyboards and a single cell of the finished animation do survive. To escape him, Littlefoot and Sarah dive into a thicket of briars. Sharptooth leaps after them, while Littlefoot becomes trapped in one of the vines. As Sharptooth bears down on him, the vine snaps backward, lashing Sharptooth's eye with thorns. I distinctly remember a close-up shot of thorns scraping against the lens of Sharptooth's eye, shutting my own eyes as if fearing the same would happen to me. When I opened my eyes again, I saw Sharptooth, his right eye now closed tight with pain, searching for the kids. He clawed his way through the brambles, sniffing frenetically like a hound after a rabbit. His snout presses down on a thorny branch sheltering the two dinosaurs, snorting out hot, noxious breaths on them. They quietly sneak away from him, their tails tucked fearfully between their legs. In a panic, Sarah rushes out into the open. Sharptooth explodes from the bushes, striking at her. As Littlefoot and Sarah try to get around him, he bites at them, only to miss every time. They try to run around from him, but he leaps out from the bushes to cut them off. When they try to run in the opposite direction, Sharptooth lowers his tail, blocking their path. He lowers his head to engulf them both, but they each run around his open maw in opposite directions. For the second time, Sharptooth leaps in front of them to finish them off. None of this footage is in the final film, though again, storyboards reveal that it was there at one point. As Sharptooth leans down to deliver the killing blow, the tail of Littlefoot's mother delivers an uppercut that sends him backwards, slamming him into a tall rock face. The fight between Littletooth's mother and Sharptooth had a total of 16 seconds removed from it. Fans were able to determine this by comparing the official soundtrack with the final soundtrack in the movie. In the original cut, Sharptooth leaps onto Littlefoot's mother's back and tears off huge, bloody chunks of flesh. This was edited in the final version so that the act only takes place in shadow. In addition, there was one point where Sharptooth bites down on the mother's neck, his teeth
digging into her skin like knives, blood gushing from the wound. You can confirm this for yourself by watching the finished film. Watch carefully during this scene, and you'll see that the mother has an inexplicable neck wound in some shots. As Sharptooth and the mother fight, she slams him with her tail, unleashing a wave of mud that causes the kids to slide onto Sharptooth's foot. There's a shot of this in one of the trailers, but it isn't in the theatrical version. The next difference I remember is not something that was cut, but rather something that was added. In the version I saw, after Littlefoot's mother quietly slips into death, the screen fades to black. The next scene promptly cuts to an almost Looney Tunes-esque group of colorful baby pterodactyls all fighting over a cherry. In the finished film, after Littlefoot's mother dies, there's a brief scene in which the grief-stricken Littlefoot encounters an old dinosaur who offers some empathy and words of compassion before going on his way. I can tell you, I could have really used a scene like that, because that's the point when I started crying and told Bluth I wanted to leave. But he shook his head and pointed to the screen. "No, it's all right, Gabe. Look at the pterodactyls. Aren't they funny, Gabe? Isn't it funny how they're all fighting over a little cherry?" He tried to sound friendly about it, but he was yelling over my cries, forcing me to look back at the screen. What was pictured was bright and colorful, as different in tone as possible from what I had just seen. I sure as hell didn't want to challenge Bluth after what he had done to Dad, and it didn't look as bad as what I saw before, so I followed his instructions and took my seat. Though the bit with the pterodactyls wasn't awful, it's not what I needed at that point. I needed some kind of solace or relief. Things only got worse when the scene randomly led back to Littlefoot reeling from depression. Even at 5 years old, I understood the pain when Littlefoot retraced his mother's footsteps, rubbing against them longingly as if somehow vicariously experiencing her through them, or when he had momentarily deluded himself into thinking that his shadow, cast large against the distant cliffside, was his mother. The narrator said it best. Then he knew for certain that he was alone. It's not until the introduction of Spike, the Stegosaurus, that the next cut that I remember happens. One of the themes that is present in the theatrical cut is the idea of intolerance. As Sarah's father growls to her, "Three horns never play with long necks." Even Littlefoot's mother maintains that all dinosaurs stick to their own kind, and Littlefoot shouldn't worry about not getting to play with Sarah because there will be many other long necks to play with once they reach the Great Valley. This scene, which appears in the counterpart book to the movie, The Land Before Time, the illustrated story, features a disagreement between Littlefoot and Sarah about whether Spike should be allowed to come with the group. While Littlefoot wants to take Spike with them, Sarah vehemently opposes him. She makes mention of the fact that Spike Tails had mostly died out long ago, and that Spike may be the last of his kind. Rather shockingly, this is her reason against accepting him into the group. If I remember correctly, which again isn't necessarily the case, she claimed that the other Leaf Eaters had essentially all decided that Spike Tails deserved to die, as if they were the least intelligent of all dinosaurs, hence why Spike can't talk. She even went as far as to claim that it would be better for them to leave him behind so Sharptooth would eat him, thus saving him from having to starve. Littlefoot refuses, so Sarah leaves the group. This scene ends when Ducky finds a branch covered in cherries to coax Spike to follow them. In the theatrical cut, you'll notice that, in all of the following scenes, Sarah is nowhere to be found. She reappears towards the end of the scene inexplicably as if she'd never left. This is because of Sarah breaking with the group temporarily after the addition of Spike. She wanders off on her own into a dark forest made of black, twisted, dead trees. The winding branches reach out for her like gnarled hands of desperate, starving beggars. Eventually, she stumbles into a small clearing in the trees. The clearing is filled with the rotting remains of all kinds of dinosaurs, each one in various states of decay.
Sarah stands frozen in place as huge, angry black flies buzz around her face. She looks around, and close-up shots reveal a dead Parasaurolophus with gray-green skin drooping off of its ribcage, even as the flesh of its face remains intact, frozen in an agonized expression. Another close-up reveals the glazed, gray eye of a dead lizard, half sunken into its skull. Looking up, she sees several small corpses dangling limply in the branches, their long necks and tails snagged on thorny limbs. Sarah turns to leave, but is stopped when she hears a horrendous screaming coming from somewhere in the darkness behind her. The petrified shrieking is accompanied by a low, ferocious growl. As booming footsteps grow louder and closer, she dives obliviously into a nearby carcass, unknowingly seeking shelter within the body of a dead Triceratops. Out of the shadows, Sharptooth comes stomping into view, another dinosaur clutched in his jaws. The other dinosaur is still alive, struggling frantically to free itself from Sharptooth's grip. The shot closes in as Sharptooth lowers his victim down to the ground, crushing down on its hip with his foot. The sound of crunching bone was so clear and loud that it actually hurt. Sharptooth's jaw closed down on the helpless creature's neck, his blade-like teeth sinking into the soft skin, blood dripping from the wound. Sharptooth begins to shake vigorously, like a dog shaking a rat. The camera finally cuts back to Sarah's mortified expression as the sounds of the dying animal fade, replaced by the horrific noise of tearing flesh. When the camera cuts back to Sharptooth, it shows him rising back up to his full height, licking blood from his lips. He scans his lair, sniffing the air intently, his wrinkled face and squinting eyes moving over the decaying mounds of meat concealing the young Triceratops. He begins moving towards it slowly, his shadow creeping over Sarah's face. He opens his jaw and rams his open mouth into the side of a dead giant, tearing off a mouthful of rancid flesh. Too busy with his morsel, Sharptooth doesn't notice as Sarah silently runs in the opposite direction. The movie proceeds as it does in the final version, with Littlefoot, Ducky, Petrie, and Spike discovering a small stream of water, following it in hopes of finding green food. But before they find it, Sarah reappears to the group, panting and with eyes filled with terror. Littlefoot asks her why she comes back, and she insists that it's better to be around a dumb old longneck and useless Spiketail than to be on her own with Sharptooth around. Littlefoot insists, as he had earlier, that Sharptooth died in the earthquake that killed his mother. He is vehemently against her returning to the group, but she earns some clout when she tracks down the green food that they had been searching for. The theatrical cut picks up here, with Sarah obnoxiously claiming she found the Great Valley upon coming across a small cluster of trees. The next few scenes are the same as they are in the theatrical version, up until the group reaches the rock that looks like a long neck. If you watch the movie now, you'll see the movie freezes for a few frames before cutting to the next scene, clearly indicating that something had been cut. That something in question is a pair of scenes, the first of which features the five of them stumbling across a small oasis. This particular scene is also documented in The Land Before Time, the illustrated story. The oasis is inhabited by two groups of dinosaurs. One of the groups is the same species as Ducky, although they are black and have bright pink lips around their bills. The other species are called the crownheads by the group, and their heads have rounded knobs of bone on the top. The two groups quarrel with each other, refusing to share their food and water. This divide is so extreme that the kids see that there are members of both groups that are sick, lying on the ground, painfully wheezing, but their own families would rather condemn them to death than make concessions to their rivals. This is when Sarah has an epiphany that hating others just for being different is wrong. After leaving the oasis, the group comes across a pit. When they look down into the ground, they see a whole graveyard's worth of sick, emaciated-looking long necks piled over and on top of each other. When the dying giants see the kids, they all begin to meekly raise their snake-like necks, crying out in agony for the children to help them. The kids try to tell the long necks that they don't know how to help them, but they won't listen. The long necks just continue to moan and wail and plead for help. Their flesh and skin rot tight around the contours of their bones, giving them an almost zombie-like appearance. Watching them struggle to get to their feet, pawing at the ground towards the kids was like watching mindless dead things rise up, angry and envious at the living. Littlefoot says that he wants to help them, but all of the kids are frightened away when they hear the distant roar of Sharptooth, prompting them to keep moving. The yelling dinosaurs are left to wallow in their filth and disease, still calling out for help, even as they fade from the view of the group. The remaining changes all deal with the climax and ending. There comes a point in the final film where Littlefoot splits from the group and goes his own way. The film then follows Sarah, Ducky, Petrie, and Spike as they wander into a volcanic field, called appropriately enough, the Mountains That Burn, as they become trapped in black bubbling ooze and on pieces of rock floating in the river of lava. Littlefoot returns to save the day. In the version Bluth showed me, the next scene after the group splits followed Littlefoot instead. This scene does appear in the finished film, but at a later point. His mother's ghost appears to him, leading him to the Great Valley. It's only after he finds it that he decides to go back to find the others. The scene plays out as it does in the final film, up until Sharptooth arrives. Having led the other dinosaurs to the Great Valley, Littlefoot and the others catch sight of Sharptooth climbing the mountains towards it. They realize that he's found the valley too, and that it wouldn't be safe for any of them or their families if Sharptooth reaches it. Look carefully when you watch the movie today, and you'll notice that, in the shot where Sharptooth is scaling the rocks, there are green plants growing on the opposite side of the mountain, the only remnant of this original ending left in the movie. During their plan to drown Sharptooth in the deep water by dropping a huge rock on him from above, Ducky calls out to Sharptooth saying, "Over here, you mean old Gipper," and then she taunts him by making faces at him. This section was cut, but the footage appears in the trailer. Eventually, the kids succeed in killing the Sharptooth, allowing all of them to enter the Great Valley and be reunited with their families. All in all, it was looking to be a happy ending for the bunch. Except that, where the theatrical cut is content to end there, with all the dinosaurs living happily ever after, the movie I saw kept going. The narrator proceeded to tell us all how it didn't matter that the dinosaurs had reached the Great Valley, because they did the same thing to the valley that they had done to the rest of the world. They ate and ate and ate until all the green food was gone, for good this time. And so the age of dinosaurs came to an end, the dinosaurs done in by careless gluttony and unchecked consumption. We never actually see any of the main characters die, but there are many silent shots of dead, desertous landscapes sprinkled with the sun-bleached remains of various dinosaurs. There is no sound, apart from the howling wind whipping sand off the dunes. The screen went to black. No fade, no credits, nothing but the sudden disappearance of the scene in front of me. The lights came back on, filling my dark-adjusted eyes with pain. If not for that instant shock, I think I would have just sat there in the dark, quietly, not moving. But Bluth knocked me out of my stupor, leaning down to look me in the eyes. "So, wasn't that great?" I was completely lost for a reply. My mouth hung open, quivering slightly as I tried to find an answer I thought would please him. When no answer came, he repeated, "Well, come on, tell me how much you liked it." I liked Littlefoot, I said to him, which was mostly true. It might have been more accurate to say I felt very sorry for him. "Yeah? Bluth said to me. Is that because he was like you? Not really, but I nodded. His fake smile faded. Isn't the world a scary place? I nodded more enthusiastically, because if this movie was any indication, then the world was very much a scary place. You can't escape the world, Gabe, he said, putting his hands on my shoulders. The world is full of cruel things. You can't run from them. You have to get rid of them. You can't escape the world. The only thing to do is to destroy it and build a better one in its place. I had absolutely no idea what the ever-loving fuck he was talking about. I nodded again, though anyone with even basic understanding of human body language should have been able to tell how uncomfortable I was. Bluth stood back, taking his hands off me. Now, Gabe, he said, his voice growing lower, the movie isn't finished yet, and I'm not supposed to show it to anyone. But since you're such a good boy, I wanted to give you a sneak peek. But don't tell anyone you saw this, okay? If you do, then your dad won't be able to work here anymore. That set me off. Why not? Because some people might be angry that you saw the movie before it was finished, and they might punish your dad. I won't say anything, I promise, I said in a terrified voice. Good boy, he said, smiling again. He led me out of the theater and back down the hall to Dad's office. Dad still wasn't back from the meeting. When Blue turned to leave, he looked back at me, put his finger on his lips, and whispered, Remember. I went back to the drawing I had left behind, but I just stared at it. The images on the pages blurred into meaningless shapes and colors as I stared vacantly at them. I put the drawing aside and thought I might draw something else. I had neither the thought nor desire to draw dinosaurs. Instead, I drew cars and trucks, though even then, I wasn't focused at all. Dad came back after what I thought was a half an hour or so. When he saw me, he immediately looked worried. Are you feeling okay? He asked me. You look sick. I'm guessing I must have looked quite pale. I'm okay, I said meekly. Far from Bluth's willful ignorance, Dad came right up to me, kneeling down to look at me when he heard my voice. He put his hands on my forehead in search of a fever, when he invariably couldn't find one. He looked confused. Buddy, did something happen? I shook my head at first, but I realized I wouldn't be able to fool him. This in turn made me realize that he was going to find out what happened, and like a chain reaction, realization turned to fear, which turned to guilt. I broke down, sobbing quietly into Dad's shoulder. He picked me up and carried me outside to the car. He put me in the passenger seat beside him, but he didn't start the car. Shh, it's okay. Shh, he said, rubbing my back gently with his hand. Whatever it is, you can tell me. I promise it'll be okay. After a while, I was able to explain to Dad what happened with Bluth in the theater through choking sobs. At first, Dad was confused at why Bluth would do such a thing, but when I finally began to explain to him all of the parts of the movie that had upset me the most, his confusion turned into blind rage. His face became so full of anger that he had to look away from me to ensure I wouldn't feel as though it was directed at me. He told me to wait in the car, and he stormed back into the office. Years later, I would learn that he had gone back inside and demanded to get in contact with the executive producers, Steven Spielberg and George Lucas. As the days went on, turning slowly into weeks, it became apparent I wasn't getting over what Bluth had shown me. Dad threatened to sue Don Bluth Studios for inappropriate conduct and for possibly scarring me for life. To examine the latter claim, Spielberg and Lucas brought in 2 child psychologists to review Bluth's cut of the film and determine if there was any content in it that was inappropriate for young children. Luckily, the 2 child psychologists were both on board with my assessment. Unlike other animated films with supposedly lost footage, including Bluth's own All Dogs Go to Heaven, most of the Land Before Time footage was destroyed by order of distributor Universal Pictures. Spielberg and Lucas were personally ashamed of what Bluth had created and did as much as they could to make sure it would never see the light of day. And frankly, I'm perfectly fine with that. I wouldn't see The Land Before Time in its current incarnation until I was 19, and it turned out to be pretty great. Beautiful, but sad. Dark, but hopeful. The version that fans want to see, or think that they want to see, would be a bastardization of the film they love. The vision of a man who was fine with hurting innocent children for the sake of his greater good. So, yeah. I'm the reason that 16 minutes were edited out of The Land Before Time before it was released in theaters.